Have you ever noticed how someone can silence you without saying a single word? How a room can suddenly shift in tension because one person stopped talking? Or how the quietest moments somehow feel the loudest? And what if I told you that silence, something you use every day without thinking, might be one of the most powerful psychological tools humans have ever developed, capable of influencing decisions, shaping relationships, triggering fear, and even controlling behavior in ways you don't consciously recognize? Because the truth is, silence is not the absence of communication. Silence is communication, and your brain responds to it automatically, instinctively, and often defenselessly. And that is exactly why people who understand the psychology of silence can use it without effort, and without you even realizing what's happening. Silence carries weight because your mind cannot leave empty space alone. And the moment someone withholds words, your brain rushes to fill in the gaps, creating interpretations, assumptions, and imagined meanings that feel real, even if they're not, which makes silence one of the simplest and most subtle ways to control a conversation or shift emotional power. Think of the last time someone gave you the silent treatment, paused too long before answering, or simply stopped showing the same level of engagement you were used to, because in that moment, your emotional system probably activated, making you hyper-aware, anxious, more focused, and more eager to restore connection, even if that meant compromising or apologizing for things you didn't actually do wrong. Silence forces your brain into a state psychologists call uncertainty overload, a condition where the mind becomes uncomfortable with the unknown and tries desperately to resolve the ambiguity. And this discomfort is exactly what makes silence so influential, because the person who remains silent is the person who forces the other to respond, explain, justify, or overcompensate. What people rarely notice is how silence creates an imbalance of psychological energy in any interaction, because communication usually feels like a mutual exchange, words for words, attention for attention. But the moment someone withholds their voice, the balance collapses and the pressure shifts entirely onto the other person. And suddenly you feel compelled to talk more, explain more, reveal more, or even please more in order to fill the void. This is why silence is such a common strategy in manipulation, conflict, and power dynamics. Because when someone refuses to respond, they force you into a kind of mental spotlight where your thoughts become louder and your vulnerabilities more exposed. Your brain is so deeply wired for social engagement that silence disrupts your sense of security, and this disruption activates primitive survival responses that evolved thousands of years ago, when social belonging meant protection, and silence from the group meant danger, exclusion, or punishment. The brain interprets silence in a social context as a possible threat, which is why your heart rate increases, your thoughts become repetitive, and your emotional sensitivity spikes. And instead of thinking clearly, you start catastrophizing, imagining worst-case scenarios, or assuming that the silence means something negative about you. This psychological discomfort is what gives silence its power, because whether someone uses silence intentionally or unconsciously, the effect on your mind is the same. You start adjusting your behavior in response to their lack of communication. Silence can make you apologize, even when you're not at fault, offer reassurance when you shouldn't need to, or give someone emotional power they never earned, which is why understanding the psychology behind silence is essential if you want to protect yourself from emotional manipulation. In relationships, silence is used more often than words to control emotional flow, because saying nothing can be more impactful than any argument or confrontation. And many people learn, consciously or unconsciously, that withholding communication forces the other person to pursue them, worry about them, or fight to restore harmony. This creates a dangerous cycle where silence becomes a reward and punishment system, teaching you that your emotional stability depends on someone else's approval, attention, or mood. And once you associate silence with emotional loss, the person using silence gains influence over your feelings. Silence can freeze a conversation, intensify guilt, deepen insecurity, or trigger attachment wounds left over from childhood. Especially if you grew up in an environment where affection or communication was inconsistent, unpredictable, or conditional. The brain is highly sensitive to silence within emotionally important relationships because silence becomes a symbol, not a neutral pause. And that symbol can mean rejection, disappointment, anger, or withdrawal of love, depending on your past experiences. If you once learned that silence meant danger or disapproval, then as an adult, you may overreact to even short moments of quiet, feeling suddenly anxious or compelled to fix things instantly, even when nothing is actually wrong. This is exactly why silence can become a method of control, because people who understand your emotional patterns can weaponize quiet moments to trigger old wounds, making you feel like you need to chase them or earn their attention. But silence doesn't just operate in romantic or personal relationships. It appears in friendships, workplaces, negotiations, and social interactions everywhere, because silence is universal, instinctive, and powerful. In social psychology, silence is often described as a dominance cue, because the person who feels more secure in a conversation can tolerate silence better than the person who feels insecure, which is why confident people often use intentional pauses, slower speech, or deliberate quiet moments to signal authority, intelligence, or self-control. On the other hand, people who fear rejection or conflict tend to rush to fill silence with explanations, reassurances, or unnecessary details, unintentionally giving away their emotional position. Silence reveals who feels confident and who feels vulnerable, who holds power and who seeks approval, who can withstand tension and who breaks under the pressure of uncertainty, which is why master communicators, leaders, and even manipulators rely on silence deliberately. But the most surprising part is this: silence controls people even when it's accidental, because your brain doesn't care whether silence is intentional or unintentional. Your brain reacts to the perception of silence, not the motive behind it. Someone might be quiet simply because they're thinking, tired, distracted, or overwhelmed. Yet your mind might interpret their silence as a message, something negative, personal, or threatening, and your emotional system responds based on that interpretation. This means silence can manipulate indirectly, without intent, because your brain is wired to create meaning where meaning doesn't exist, filling the quiet with assumptions shaped by your insecurities, fears, hopes, and past emotional pain. Silence becomes a mirror that reflects your internal world, amplifying your deepest worries or desires. And because of that, silence is one of the most revealing psychological experiences. When someone stops talking, your own mind becomes louder, and the thoughts that surface during silence often tell you more about your emotional wounds than the person who is quiet. This psychological phenomenon is why silence can feel threatening, even in harmless situations, and why people sometimes overreact to brief pauses, interpreting them as judgment, disappointment, or emotional withdrawal, when none of those things are actually happening. Yet despite how uncomfortable it can feel, silence is also used in therapy, healing, and self-discovery, because silence forces introspection, disrupts compulsive thinking, and reveals emotional truths we usually avoid. The same silence that manipulates can also transform, because silence exposes what your mind suppresses, bringing unresolved emotions to the surface. But in the hands of the wrong person, silence becomes something far more dangerous, a tool for control, manipulation, and emotional dominance. And this is where the true power of silence reveals itself, because silence is not neutral. Silence is not empty, and silence is not passive. Silence is active, psychological, and deeply influential, shaping emotions and behavior in ways most people never notice. And the more you understand this, the harder it becomes for anyone to use silence against you. Silence controls people not because of what it is, but because of what the mind thinks it is. And the moment silence appears, your brain begins projecting meaning into the quiet, building emotional stories based on past experiences, rather than the present moment, which means silence becomes a trigger that activates memories, insecurities, fears, and assumptions you didn't consciously choose. And this projection is what gives silence so much invisible power. When someone goes quiet, especially someone whose opinion matters to you, your brain doesn't simply register that they're not speaking. Your brain instantly tries to interpret the silence, searching for emotional clues, hidden messages, or unspoken judgments. And in that search, the mind often exaggerates danger, creating psychological tension that wasn't actually there. This is why silence can feel heavy, even when nothing is wrong, and why one quiet moment can spiral into overthinking and emotional instability, turning silence into an unintentional form of psychological control. In neuroscience, silence activates the brain's threat detection system, because humans evolved in social groups where communication was essential for survival. And when communication stopped abruptly, it often signaled danger, conflict, or rejection. So your brain still reacts to silence as if it's a threat that must be resolved immediately. This primitive wiring explains why silence makes your heart beat faster, why your thoughts begin racing, and why your emotional sensitivity spikes. Because your brain interprets social silence as a potential loss of connection, and connection has always been tied to safety in human evolution. So when someone withholds communication, your subconscious mind tries to restore the connection by adjusting your behavior, which is exactly how silence begins shaping your decisions without you realizing it. This psychological pressure is what makes silence a powerful tool in arguments, negotiations, and emotional conflict. Because the person who stays silent gains control over the direction and emotional tone of the interaction, while the person who feels uncomfortable with silence begins revealing more information, apologizing prematurely, or softening their stance just to break the tension. Silence creates a psychological imbalance where one person seeks relief from discomfort and the other person holds the key to that relief. And this emotional imbalance is the foundation of silent control. Someone who understands this, even accidentally, may use silence to avoid responsibility, to make you feel guilty, to force you to over-explain yourself, or to create a dynamic where you chase their communication while they hold back. And over time, this becomes a pattern that places your emotional state in their hands. In relationships, this dynamic can evolve into emotional dependency, where one partner becomes hypersensitive to silence because they associate it with punishment, anger, or emotional abandonment, and the other partner learns that withholding communication gives them power, even if they never meant to manipulate in the first place. Silence becomes a signal of displeasure, a withdrawal of approval, or a reminder that your emotional security depends on their behavior. And this slowly trains your nervous system to avoid conflict, to walk on eggshells, or to modify your personality just to keep the peace. This is how silence transitions from communication to control. Because once you learn to fear someone's silence, they no longer need to raise their voice, criticize you, or threaten you. their quiet becomes enough to shape your actions. What makes silence especially dangerous as a psychological tool is that it can be used in different ways. Some forms of silence are passive, others are weaponized, and some are subtle enough that you don't even realize you're being controlled. One common form is the silent treatment, where someone deliberately withholds communication to punish you, create guilt, or force compliance. And because silence is painful and destabilizing, you may break down emotionally, even when you're not responsible for the conflict. Another form is strategic silence, where someone pauses unnecessarily long or refuses to clarify their thoughts, causing you to second-guess yourself or question whether you did something wrong. And this type of silence is often used to gain psychological leverage. There's also avoidance silence, where someone shuts down because they're uncomfortable or afraid of conflict. And while this type may not be manipulative, the effect on the other person is similar, because silence always leaves room for interpretation, and interpretation leads to emotional tension that influences behavior. Close relationships amplify the impact of silence, because rejection, even subtle rejection, activates the same brain regions associated with physical pain, which means silence can hurt you more deeply than words. When someone you care about refuses to communicate, your emotional regulation system becomes unstable, making you more likely to overthink, blame yourself, or try to restore harmony at any cost. And this vulnerability is where silence becomes a form of unintentional emotional control. Over time, this cycle conditions you to avoid confrontation, suppress your needs, or tolerate unhealthy behaviors, simply to avoid the discomfort of silence. And this is how silence becomes a psychological mechanism that shapes your identity, your confidence, and your emotional boundaries. The truth is, silence controls people because silence forces people to hear themselves. And most people are not comfortable listening to their own thoughts. The quiet creates mental space that the mind rushes to fill with assumptions, insecurities, fears, or past emotional wounds. And because the mind tends to lean toward negativity when information is missing, silence often leads to negative interpretations. If you carry unresolved abandonment wounds, silence will trigger fear. If you carry guilt, silence will trigger self-blame. If you carry insecurity, silence will trigger overthinking. And the person who uses silence, even unintentionally, becomes the center of your emotional reaction, which is how silence quietly positions them as the one who holds emotional control. In conversations, silence can also shift cognitive power, because the person who remains quiet appears more confident, more composed, and more in control, while the person who rushes to fill silence appears more nervous or emotionally exposed. This creates an illusion of dominance, which is why silence is used strategically in leadership, interrogation, sales, and negotiation. Because people are psychologically wired to interpret silence as a sign of power or authority. The one who can sit comfortably in silence appears more secure, which naturally makes others feel less secure, creating a hierarchy of emotional stability where silence becomes a symbol of strength, and speaking becomes a symbol of seeking approval or relief. But the psychological impact of silence goes much deeper than communication. Silence affects memory, perception, and emotional interpretation. When someone goes silent during a conflict, your brain becomes hyper-focused on the relationship, replaying past experiences, searching for patterns, and amplifying unresolved emotional wounds, which means silence becomes a lens through which you reinterpret the entire relationship. The longer the silence lasts, the more your mind fills the void with imagined narratives, often negative or exaggerated, And these imagined narratives can become more emotionally real than the actual situation, which gives silence the ability to distort your perception and shape your emotional reality. The most fascinating part is that silence doesn't only control what you say, silence controls what you feel, because silence amplifies emotion, intensifies insecurity, and magnifies the significance of the relationship. Silence turns small concerns into big ones, minor misunderstandings into emotional storms, and simple pauses into psychological threats, because your brain evolved to fear social disconnection, and silence symbolizes disconnection. This is why people become anxious when texts go unanswered, why delayed responses feel personal, and why withdrawal of attention feels more painful than direct conflict. Because silence activates the emotional circuits that evolved to protect you from isolation. Yet for all its discomfort, silence remains one of the most effective psychological tools. Because silence is invisible, silence is deniable, and silence is socially acceptable, which means people can use silence to control you without appearing aggressive or manipulative. Silence gives the appearance of calmness while causing internal chaos in others. And this subtlety is what makes silence so psychologically potent, because the person being controlled often blames themselves rather than recognizing the dynamic. And this self-blame reinforces the control even further. But despite all this, silence is not inherently negative. It becomes negative only when it is used intentionally or unintentionally to manipulate, punish, or control someone emotionally. Silence can also be strategic, healing, grounding, or introspective when used consciously and respectfully, because silence has the power to reset emotional intensity, clarify thoughts, and reveal truths that words would only hide. The key is learning how to recognize the difference between silence that heals and silence that harms, because once you see silence clearly, you stop being controlled by it. The real danger of silence as a psychological weapon is not the absence of sound itself, but the way your mind tries to fill that vacuum. Because when someone withdraws their voice, their attention, or their emotional presence, your brain begins generating explanations that almost always place the blame on you, convincing you that you said the wrong thing, did the wrong thing, or somehow caused the shift in energy even when you didn't. And this internal narrative can become so powerful that you start policing your own behavior around them just to avoid facing that void again, which is exactly how silence becomes one of the most effective forms of control ever used in human relationships. The moment you start adjusting yourself to prevent their withdrawal, the power dynamic has already shifted, because people who use silence strategically know that confusion is one of the strongest psychological hooks, and the more uncertain you become about where you stand with them, the more tightly you cling to the hope of reassurance, turning their absence into something you chase as if it were presence, even though it is nothing but emotional starvation posing as communication. What makes this so insidious is that silence feels peaceful from the outside, but when you're the one on the receiving end, it becomes a storm of unanswered questions, imagined scenarios, and spiraling self-doubt. And because the human brain is wired to interpret social disconnection as danger, the quietness of another person can trigger the same neural alarms as physical threat, leading to panic, restlessness, and an almost desperate urge to do something, anything, to restore the connection, even if it means apologizing for things you didn't do or abandoning your own boundaries. When someone realizes that you are more afraid of their silence than they are of losing you, they gain a form of leverage that doesn't require shouting, arguing, or confrontation, because all they have to do is withdraw slightly, speak less, respond slower, or pull back emotionally, and your mind will do the rest of the work for them, building stories, assigning guilt, and forcing you into a cycle of self-correction that ultimately benefits them more than it does you. The worst part is that silence rarely looks like abuse on the surface, because society tends to view loudness, anger, and explosive behavior as the real red flags. Yet some of the most psychologically controlled people in the world are not controlled through yelling, but through strategic quietness that creates a constant tension of wondering if you are enough, if they are mad at you, or if you're about to lose them. And that quiet uncertainty eats away at your confidence until their approval becomes the only relief you crave. You may not realize how deep this influence runs until you start noticing changes in your behavior, like checking your phone more often, rereading your messages to see if you said something wrong, worrying excessively about their mood, or feeling the need to justify or explain yourself even when nothing seems wrong. And each of these tiny micro-adjustments is evidence of psychological conditioning, caused not by words, but by the deliberate lack of them. Silence can also create a false sense of superiority in the person using it, because the more you try to break the quiet, the more they feel validated in holding that position of emotional privilege. And soon they begin to believe that withdrawing from you gives them control, making them less willing to communicate openly and more likely to use quietness as a reward and punishment system that keeps you emotionally dependent on their next moment of attention. Over time, this dynamic can change how you see yourself, because the brain begins forming associations between their silence and your worth, meaning that every time they pull away, your mind interprets it as a judgment against your value, and eventually you start doing their job for them by criticizing yourself, questioning your instincts, suppressing your needs, and shrinking parts of yourself in hopes that doing so will make them come closer instead of retreating again. The tragedy is that silence can be just as damaging as verbal aggression, because at least anger gives you something tangible to react to, whereas silence forces you into a psychological maze where every wrong turn feels like your fault. And this emotional uncertainty can be more exhausting than outright conflict, because it keeps you in a state of mental hypervigilance where you are constantly monitoring their behavior to predict when the next withdrawal might happen. When someone knows your brain fills silence with fear instead of calm, they can weaponize that instinct to manipulate your decisions, because the threat of emotional distance becomes a silent yet powerful form of punishment. And you may find yourself agreeing to things you don't want, accepting treatment you don't deserve, or over-explaining your every action simply because the idea of them going quiet again feels unbearable. It's important to understand that not all silence is manipulation, because healthy people use silence for reflection, emotional processing, or personal space. But the difference lies in intention, communication, and consistency, because healthy silence feels respectful, stable, and safe, while manipulative silence feels unpredictable, sharp, and suffocating, leaving you constantly guessing instead of understanding what is happening. The reason silence can reshape a relationship so drastically is that the human brain is programmed to avoid social exclusion, and evolutionary psychology shows that the fear of being ignored can trigger a fight or flight response stronger than nearly any verbal rejection, because during ancient times, being cast out of a group meant losing protection, resources, and survival. And even today, that instinct shows up as anxiety, overthinking, and a desperate urge to reconnect when someone emotionally withdraws. People who use silence as control may not always do it consciously, because some learned it from childhood environments where love was inconsistent, approval was conditional, and attention had to be earned. So they repeat this pattern in adulthood without realizing they are creating the same emotional confusion they once lived through. But others use silence deliberately, because they know it keeps people emotionally compliant and constantly seeking reassurance. The moment you begin to understand how your brain reacts to silence, you start to reclaim your power, because awareness breaks the automatic cycle of self-blame and allows you to see the manipulation for what it is, giving you the strength to pause, breathe, and recognize that someone else's withdrawal is not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of their emotional immaturity or their desire for control. You learn to stop chasing, stop explaining, and stop trying to earn the attention of someone who withholds communication as a way to feel powerful. Because once you understand the psychology behind silence, you realize that the person who controls the conversation controls nothing compared to the person who controls their reaction to it. And that shift in mindset is the beginning of freedom rather than the beginning of confusion. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.